Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our presentation. It is a symposium entitled See My Pain? Experiencing Racism versus Bystander Views of Racism. It consists of 4 talks presented by me, Pani Radhakrishnan, Eros D'Souza, Navante Peacock, and Mary Inman. Our symposium is based on tests of the socialization stressor model of workplace racial harassments, antecedents, consequences, and implication. It was a chapter that we published in Diversity and Inclusion in Organization. Feel free to ask us for a copy of this at the end of this presentation. The 4 papers that you will see in this symposium present tests of this model in various ways. So talks 1, 3, and 4 talk about the societal and employee and organizational antecedents of racial harassment and discrimination. Talks 1 and 2 also talk about the consequences of racial harassment and discrimination. We hope that at the end of this symposium, you have a holistic and comprehensive understanding of what is racial harassment and discrimination and what are some of those antecedents. Details about our model is found on the book chapter, so please request that if you would want to have a copy on ResearchGate and also via email. I will present now on a particular aspect of this model, namely the nature of the stress of racial harassment and discrimination in academia. This paper is co-authored with Mary Inman and Kim Schneider. In this paper, we look at the role of student race and organizational characteristics in predicting what kind of stressors graduate students face and the outcomes of these stressors. So although we do not explicitly test the role of stereotypes or societal stereotypes, we implicitly test those variables in terms of student characteristics. So we look at the role of student race and organizational characteristics, in particular, what we think is the racial composition of the organization that would then in turn predict racial harassment and racial discrimination of the students. In addition, we would also like to see how the students are coping with graduate studies in particular. So we also measured graduate student stress. And towards the end, we would like to examine the impact of these stressors on student outcomes. In particular, how satisfied they are with their graduate education, how satisfied they are with the students that they work with, how satisfied they are with the advisors who supervise them, what are their health conditions as a result of these discriminatory behaviors, and finally, how likely are they to quit graduate studies while they experience these stressors in their workplace. In our study, we examined 2 samples of graduate students at 2 different campuses in the southwest of the United States. On both these campuses, visible minority students who were primarily of Latinx descent, but also included Asian and Middle Eastern and some Black and Indigenous students, and they represent approximately 40 to 60% of the student body. In one campus, we had about 500 students. Of those, 184 were visible minority and 328 were white students. On the other campus, we had a smaller sample, but as you can see from this graph, they were approximately similar in size for visible minority and white students. The overall response rate was 20%, and parts of this data have already been published in other articles listed here. Some of the measures that we wanted to look at, in addition to our core measures of stress being racial discrimination, and graduate student stress, we also measured satisfaction with supervisors, satisfaction with co-workers, the health conditions that students experienced, life satisfaction, and then we also measured a previously published correlate, racial harassment. We looked at the discriminant validity of our measures at first. So we looked at the discriminant validity of the racial discrimination measure that we gave to the students and the graduate student stress measure that they completed. We established the discriminant validity in various ways. First, we will present confirmatory factor analysis. Then we will present mean differences on these measures between the racial groups. Third, we will look at intercorrelations with other stressors and with outcomes. And finally, we will present hierarchical regressions with other stressors to see if our new measures have any additional predictive validity in predicting the outcomes that students face. So first, we would like to focus on the nature of academic stressors that graduate students might face in their workplace. As I mentioned before, we measured racial harassment. This has already been published in a previous article. But now we wanted to add other measures, and so we wanted to look at the nature of racial discriminatory experiences that the students might experience. We also assessed the nature of stress that they might experience just from being a graduate student. To give you an idea of what are those questions that we asked them. So for instance, in the racial discrimination measure, we asked them if they were given opportunities. And in this we mentioned, do they get timely information, contacts with employers, and recommendations to obtain jobs after they graduate. We also asked other questions. For example, are they asked to repeat coursework? Are they given an office in a less desirable location? These were all tapping into what we thought of as racial discrimination measures. We asked them to compare themselves to similarly qualified people of different races and judge the extent to which they were given these opportunities or asked to repeat coursework or given an office in a less desirable location. In terms of the measure of graduate student stress, we asked them how stressful these different aspects were. For example, that they lacked training, or for example, that other students didn't talk to them, or for example, that they don't receive enough feedback from their advisor, or that their advisor may rarely follow through. At first, once we administered these questionnaires, we did a confirmatory factor analysis on our first sample comprising of the first campus. And if you recall, we had about 500 participants in that campus. And we looked at how the structure of that scale emerged. We then cross-validated that structure using the sample from the second campus. So if you recall, the second campus sample was approximately 334 students who replied to our survey. So here in this slide, you can see the fit indices which look acceptable for both these new measures of academic stress that we measured in our study. Specifically, the measures for racial discrimination and the graduate student stress scale. So now we established some discriminant validity of the two new measures. And now we look at the mean differences between racial groups. So recall that our model predicts that student race and organizational characteristics both affect the nature and incidence of racial harassment and discrimination. We also wanted to see how much stress they experience in general that may not be directly attributed to race, but still a factor in their student experiences. So we combined all three stressors to see how these antecedents affected their experiences. So now I will present these measures, the differences by racial groups, to test to see whether there is discriminant validity between these different kinds of measures between the racial groups. So as you can see on this slide, white students in our sample reported higher levels of psychological undermining when compared to visible minority students. And this was true of both campuses. So we see an effect now of organizational characteristics as having an impact, and student race as also as having an impact on racial discrimination experiences. Then we looked at how the racial harassment experiences differ across racial groups and across campuses for both these samples. Recall that this measure of racial harassment has already been published, so we looked at the two factors extracted in that article: verbal derogation and exclusion. And here again you see campus differences by race. So here in campus 1, visible minorities reported more verbal derogation. But in campus 2, there were no significant differences by graduate students' race in terms of the racial harassment experiences they experienced. Finally, to establish the discriminant validity of these measures, we also looked at how graduate student stress means differs by racial groups. And we also examined whether they differ by campus. Again, here we see a different pattern. Campus 1, there are no significant differences in graduate student stress by student race. But in campus 2, the students of different racial groups did differ significantly in the amount of graduate student stress they experience. In particular, interactions with other students and the quality of the advisor's communication differed between whites and visible minority students on sample 2. So it seems like there are three major stressors that students experience when they are going to graduate school. And these stressors are affected both by the race of the students and also by the organizational characteristics of the campus that they are attending. Recall I mentioned that the campus was approximately 40 to 60% visible minority student composition. Beyond that, we don't really have much other information about these two campuses. Suffice to say that there were many first generation students on both campuses, and that they were predominantly in the southwest of the United States, one campus being closer to the border and another campus being a little bit further away. But beyond that, there were no other major metrics that we can assess on how these organizations and campuses differ. So we just remain with the conclusion that both student race and racial composition of the organization seems to predict the nature and intensity of academic stressors that students experience. In particular, the racial harassment they experience, the racial discrimination they experience, and the general level of stress of being a graduate student. Now we want to see the extent to which these variables now can predict student outcomes. So we looked at both existing measures of racial harassment, which have been established to predict job satisfaction, life satisfaction, and health satisfaction. So to our model, we now add racial discrimination, and then we also add the stressor of being a graduate student. To establish that the impact of these variables on student outcomes, we first do some preliminary analysis. In this slide, you can see the correlation between these three stressors amongst themselves for different racial groups. So in this slide, you see the correlation for visible minority students is above the diagonal. And those correlations are positive and significant. In particular, the correlation between racial harassment and graduate students is significant and positive for visible minority students. However, as you can see, the correlations below the diagonal for the white students, those correlations are tending to be negative and not significant. Remember that our sample size was pretty similar for both the white and visible minority students. Now we look at another way of testing, do these stressors predict outcomes, and whether these stressors predict outcomes differentially for the different racial groups in our samples. We look at the correlations between these stressors for visible minorities, which are in blue in this table and before the slash, and the correlation for these stressors for whites in our samples, which are in purple and after the slash. In general, you will see from the slide that the visible minority students, the stressors are correlated with health conditions, life satisfaction, supervisor satisfaction, and job withdrawal. All these are in yellow and are significant. So graduate student stress seems to really affect students of visible minority groups. We can also see on the top line that racial harassment seems to predict life satisfaction for visible minority students. The question is, when we put all these stressors in the common model, which one has predictive validity? Which one predicts over and above each other? So we tested our model to see if our new measure of racial discrimination predicts over and above graduate student stress and racial harassment in predicting health outcomes. And here you can see that racial discrimination does have an increased predictive validity over and above graduate student stress in predicting health conditions. And this was the only significant pattern we found. There was no significant relation between racial discrimination and health conditions for whites. We think that graduate student stress is so severe that it cannot be overcome with racial discrimination. But we do see that racial discrimination still predicts over and above graduate student stress and racial harassment in the health conditions of our visible minority students. So, I hope that our data show that there are many stressors that students face in their campuses and that these stressors contribute to their outcomes. We showed in our analysis that both student race and organizational composition can predict three different kinds of stressors that students experience when they go to graduate school. These are racial harassment, racial discrimination, and graduate student stress. Further, we show that these three stressors also have an impact on outcomes. In particular, we showed that the correlations were stronger for visible minority students on most of these outcome variables. Students who experience racial harassment and/or discrimination and who experience stress of being a graduate student and the visible minority students who experience these stressors are more likely to suffer from lowered job satisfaction, lowered supervisor satisfaction, lowered coworker satisfaction, lowered health conditions, and increased job withdrawal from experiencing these stressors. We hope that you are able to get some information about the nature of stressors and how they might impact the students while they are going to graduate school. We're so happy that you listened to our talks. And we will now go on to our next presentation by Eros. Thank you for listening to our talk. And if you have any questions or would like to have copies of our future publications or the current ones, please send us an email at the listed emails below. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Inman. I want to talk about how people perceive racism, specifically the advantaged groups. How do they decide about racism? We'll look at their perspective, the evidence they consider, their emotions in the situation, and their personality traits. So all of these talks in this symposium have been couched in the socialization stressor model of workplace racism. The first couple talks were telling you about how people experience racism and some of the mapping onto correlates onto health, for example, in Pani's paper. We had a paper by Navante who's looking at prototypes and how prototypes are influential in perceiving discrimination. This talk of mine is showing how bystanders, namely people who are in privileged groups, how they go about deciding when an event is racism or not, and how the features of the situation, as well as their personality traits, influence when they perceive discrimination in that situation and in situations down the road. If you'd like a copy of this stressor model, please contact Pani. I've given her email here, and I'll have it again at the end of the slides. So here's Mark. He's a Caucasian male college student, along with his fellow colleagues, and all of them are encountering a situation where they hear racial inequalities exist, and they might be reading a news story like this one that is examining college students' hiring rates after internships and finding out that white college students are disproportionately getting jobs more easily and readily, permanent jobs more so than blacks. And they might also hear about the performance on the lower right, the quality of the performance of the workers, the interns, college students, when they were in the internships. And here you can see, for example, overall the black students were outperforming the white students. However, the white students are the ones who are getting those permanent jobs. So we have this situation and we have to make sense out of it. So what I'm theorizing is that I think that the appraisal theory of intergroup inequality proposed by Leach and colleagues is very influential and possibly very helpful for us to understand how advantage groups perceive events and decide if they see racism or not. What I'm arguing is from their theory is that your group status. Peggy McIntosh talks about how there is a line of privilege and we have many social identities, and at times we are in the privileged group or the advantage group, and other times we're in the disadvantaged group. But you're learning about an intergroup inequality and you belong to one of those groups and you're in the advantaged group. That's going to be influential about how you see the situation. Also, are you focusing on your own group or are you focusing on the disadvantaged group? And also, is there any legitimizing information available, such as performance information that might sway you and your judgments? So Harth et al. Has done research who says that when we are giving these situations, we need to appraise, and borrowing from social categorization theory and theories of emotion. And what they're arguing is that these are like three independent variables that all can trigger specific emotions. And the specific emotions are right here on the right-hand side. And so when advantage groups are focusing on their own group, have an in-group focus, and they hear that their group has been performing well, so that's high legitimizing information, so it's perceived, they're going to experience in-group pride. And when you have in-group pride, then you would not want to be compensating the out-group. When they argued that when you have an in-group focus and you are also, you're hearing again that your racial group is getting more jobs more readily than another group, and yet the Black Americans are outperforming your group, then you should have group guilt. And if you're focusing on the out group, so the disadvantaged group, we are learning about this, and you're seeing that they are at a disadvantage, and it's an unfair disadvantage that would elicit outgroup sympathy in the person. And if you heard that, for example, outgroup focus with a legitimate, so you're thinking about African Americans not getting jobs, and yet white students are outperforming Black students, you would have an emotion of disdain or contempt for the African Americans, the disadvantaged groups. So Harth et al. Ran this study to see whether these emotions were actually elicited or triggered. And they found that 3 out of the 4 conditions, the answer was yes. In the outgroup focused legitimate condition, they did not find disdain came up. They thought students might have been confused on the wording, but it also does reinforce negative stereotyping towards the disadvantaged group. From there on, they did not use that condition, and I did not in my 3 studies either. So they did find that these emotions were also predictive of whether, in the predicted way, pride, no outgroup compensation, and outgroup guilt, and more so sympathy, predicted outgroup compensation. They never asked the people whether they thought that particular event was racism or not. So I want to know, how do you see the inequality? Is this racism? And more importantly, I want to know, do these emotions carry over to new situations? So here's my mediation model. I'm saying that we have our conditions, and a specific condition compared to the other 2 is going to elicit pride or sympathy or guilt in the advantaged group member. And in the immediate situation, if you feel pride, then you're not going to see the situation, the racial inequality, as racism. You're not going to compensate the outgroup. If you have sympathy and guilt, then you should see the racial inequality as discrimination and compensate the outgroup. Now we're going to move people into a new situation, and now they're going to read about other forms or instances that involve different groups with different races. For example, you're reading about how a shop owner or a store clerk is following around African American shoppers. Is that an event? Is that event seen as racism? How about when shoppers are giving their credit cards and Latino or African American shoppers have their credit questioned, but not other groups? Is that racism? And I'm wondering whether these emotions of pride, sympathy, guilt from situation 1 carry over into interpreting these new situations in a similar manner. So if we think analogously, and I see I'm in a privileged group, be it with the hiring, and then that's true in other situations, then we would expect the same carryover, where pride, people who are feeling pride in one situation are not likely to say that the shopping is racism. But if you felt sympathy and guilt and you were in those conditions, then people would say yes, that differential shopping treatment was racism. These are young college students who are Caucasian, and we also have other forms of discrimination like ageism. To what extent do these emotions carry over and affect perceptions of ageism? And I'm going to argue that on the one hand, yeah, if people are feeling that your group has outperformed, is doing well, feeling pride in situation 1, may actually minimize seeing an instance such as there's a car accident between a young and an older driver. The police comes over and assumes that the poor eyesight of the older person caused the wreck and gave the ticket to only the older person. Is that ageism? And it very well may be that when people are now privileged in situation 2 with age, that their emotions might carry over and influence their perceptions of ageism in that similar manner. People also have their own personality traits from their lived experiences, where prior research suggests that gender and attributional complexity and liberals are more likely to perceive racism and systems of barriers of that create these inequalities more so than the other groups. If you have a strong white ethnic identity, that might be negatively related to seeing racism. because that's a threat to one's resources and to one's group. So I have 7 different hypotheses. The first 3 are what you've seen already. The in-group focus, legitimate conditions should create pride, which hinders seeing discrimination. The in-group focus, illegitimate conditions should create group guilt, which facilitates seeing discrimination. And then compensation. Out-group focus, so I'm focusing on the disadvantages the Black people have had in this hiring situation, should create sympathy in the advantage group and facilitate seeing racism and compensation. Women as targets of sexism should more readily see discrimination, more so than men. People who are high in attributional complexity, and also number 6 with liberals, both of them are more readily likely to see the societal barriers that can create the inequality, and so they're more likely to see discrimination. Conservatives are less likely to see discrimination. The inequality would be explained more by the trait laziness of the outgroup, for example. And then strong white identity should be negatively related to seeing discrimination. So the study, I had 3. I'm telling you just about study 3, where we have a video and the news stories are the same. We had 141 subjects, and everybody came in, and I've already assessed their personality traits. And I tell them these are perceptions of human interactions. They all listen to a video of an African-American man talk, and it's a scripted interview about the negative stereotyping towards Blacks and the positive stereotyping towards whites that he witnessed when he was in work and also when he was looking for work, and how frustrated he felt. And then they read one of those 3 news conditions stories where the focus, like white college students, would be these are all white Caucasian subjects, or it would be Black students are disadvantaged at the top if it was an outgroup focus, and then providing the stories about getting jobs after college. And then we also gave performance summaries of the quality of the performance in the lower right, suggesting a legitimate or an illegitimate base. So our dependent variables are the emotions, and then those 3 perceptions and compensation. And the first 2, hiring and compensation, is the immediate situation. And correlation-wise, a lot of the hypotheses were supported, in that the gender and attributional complexity on the far right-hand side there with the outcomes in the first 2 rows. As predicted, people high in attributional complexity were seeing discrimination and compensating. Same with women, same with liberals, but the white identity was not related. And then down further lower, like row 8 or so, pride tended to be related negatively to seeing racism and ageism, and guilt and sympathy were positively related. Most importantly, we ran a hierarchical regressions, and the 4 dependent variables are in these different columns, and you can kind of see a pattern emerging here. So we want to know whether these emotions predict variation above and beyond the personality traits. Gender ate up a lot of variation. And so the immediate hiring seen as racism is that first column. And you can see that gender, liberals, the political affiliation predicted it, the condition did as well. And all 3 emotions predicted hiring seen as racism as we predicted. Compensation with this video, guilt was related to seeing or to compensating, but it was primarily eaten up with the females. Saw it compensated more so than did the men. When we move into a new situation, indeed, women saw racism, subsequent racism and ageism more so than men. Political affiliation, also conservatives tended to minimize seeing subsequent racism. And most critically, there was a pattern across all 3 studies where pride in situation 1 tended to minimize seeing racism and ageism, and sympathy tended to facilitate seeing ageism and racism. So back to the model, we tend to see pride and sympathy as our strong predictors here, and that tends to replicate Hearth. about the emotions with compensation, but this is a different dependent variable here. And then with the traits, 3 out of the 4 were as predicted. Ethnic identity did not relate. So we have a mediated model where the more pride a person felt, then the less likely they were to say other events were racism in these white college students. So the appraisal theory is very helpful to us. In understanding how advantaged groups see racism, their opinions really matter in terms of change and social change. The emotions did carry over. Pride hindered and sympathy facilitated seeing ageism and racism beyond those personality traits. And as I said, compensation, pride, when there's no video, pride reduced the likelihood to compensate the outgroup, and guilt tended to facilitate it when there was a video. So again, thank you very much. Here is I welcome questions. Please send me an email, and I hope to see you in a future live SPSP. Take care now. Thank you.